Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another session in the lecture series in Baha'i Studies at the University of Haifa. Sorry, I'm mixing for tomorrow's lecture. Yes, I'm sorry. Well, welcome to another lecture in the Ezri Center seminar, and we have the honor today to host a very distinguished guest, which is a very really a great honor for us, Dr. Heshmat Moayyad, and I would like to thank him and his wife for coming here, and also thank the Baha'i World Center, and particularly Dr. Hoda Mahmoudi, which through her endeavors and help and assistance was this thing could form and happen. Thank you. Dr. Heshmat Moayyad was born in Hamadan, Iran, and traveled widely through the towns and villages of that country in his youth. He earned his BA in Persian and Arabic literature from the University of Tehran in 1949. He continued his education in German in Persian literature, Islamic studies, and German at the University of Frankfurt am Main, where he completed his PhD in 1958. He began his teaching career in Frankfurt and then moved to Istituto Universitario Orientale in Naples, Italy. In 1962, he came to the United States for the first time as a lecturer at Harvard University, at a time when Persian literature was not yet offered in many universities in that country. He returned in 1966 with his family, assuming the position of assistant professor at the University of Chicago, where he established what would become a vibrant Persian studies program, and where he has held the position of professor of Persian language and literature in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilization since 1974. Professor Moayyad's scholarly contribution on the literature, religion, and history of Iran include 10 books and 180 articles and reviews written in 4 languages. He has also edited and translated several collections of literary works into English and German, introducing to the West for the first time the countless modern Persian writers. I have here few books of his, actually all his books that Haifa University has, which means that in relation to the 10 books we are still much short. So we have to go into ameliorate this position, and I will circulate this between you. Professor Moayyad has served on the advisory board of Encyclopedia Iranica, the quarterly Chante Iran Shenasi, the Journal of Baha'i Studies, and the Baha'i Encyclopedia Project. He was the book reviewer and editor of Iran Nameh and of Iran Shenasi, 2 very prestigious periodicals in Persian from 1988 to the present day. He has been a visiting professor at UCLA and the Harvard Summer School, as well as at the University of Damascus, the experience of which he encapsulated in an engaging article in Iran Shenasi, Safarnameh Sham. He has also traveled to Iran in the 1970s and South Asia in the 1980s to lecture and conduct research. In 1988, he visited the rich manuscript collections of the Raza Library in Rampur, Khodabakhsh Library in Patna, and Abul Kalam Azad Library in Aligarh in India, and lectured at the Aligarh Muslim University. They knew you are Baha'i? At Chicago, he was the founder and host of the Persian Poetry Evenings, Shab-e-Sher, from 1983 to 1989. At the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, he organized the weekly Persian Circle, Anjuman Sokhan, which for decades has provided an important forum for reading and lectures by innumerable poets and writers from Iran, Afghanistan, and Tajikistan, as well as Persian-speaking scholars. In 1988, Professor Moayyad organized a major conference on the classical Indo-Persian poet Amir Khosrow, which was attended by scholars from all over the world. In 1989, he organized a 3-day conference on Parvin Etesami, one of the more modern poets of Iran. Many of the professors who now teach Persian language and literature or Iranian history and religions or Islamic studies at various universities in North America, Germany, Italy, and Japan were once his students. Dr. Moayyad's lecture today is on Goethe and Hafez, and the floor is entirely yours.
I don't really know how should I thank you. With which language should I use?
You have,
I don't know.
I know four. Whether you more.
Thank you very much. Very generous. And thank you and your university for inviting me to give a lecture here. It's really a great pleasure. You know, I guess, how much my heart is attached and my wife attached to this country and to you, all of you.
Thank you.
Well, I guess I will have to read my presentation a little too fast in order to get it done today. Hafez and Goethe. Even in our world today, Johann Gottfried Herder's statement from more than 250 years ago in his Humanitätsbriefe, Letters of Humanity, seems to be valid. He wrote, aus der Poesie lernen wir Zeiten und Nationen gewiss tiefer kennen als auf dem täuschenden, trostlosen Wege der politischen und Kriegsgeschichte. That means it is from poetry that we gain a deeper knowledge about the times and nations than from the deceptive, disconsolate ways of political and military history. In that sense, I think it's worthwhile to look at Goethe and Hafez together. But before beginning with the actual subject of this talk, I would like to offer a few introductory points for the audience. Articles and books on Goethe and translations of his works in all major languages of the world fill practically an entire library. This talk is therefore not more than a drop in that ocean. Secondly, Hafez has been known in the East and in the West for centuries. Thousands of articles, long and short, have been written about him. Alone the number of articles written in Persian by Iranian scholars in the last 100 years exceeds 7,000. Thirdly, according to the most reliable sources, Hafez has written slightly under 500 ghazals, best comparable to the sonnet, consisting of 7 to 12 monorhyme distiches, with the poet's pen name appearing in the last or penultimate line of the ghazal. The subject matter being lyrical, not excluding religious and even veiled political topics. That means the poetical output of Hafez comprises under 5,000 verses, plus several short fragments and a Saghiname containing poems addressed to cupbearers, whereas other poets like Maulana Rumi and Sahib, too well known to you, I am sure, of Tabriz, Sahib of Tabriz, have composed 10 to 20 times as many poems as Hafez. Yet every single line of Hafez in itself, and detached from the one before and after, is considered, at least by his Iranian readers, as a pearl to be looked at and admired in its beautiful style. Its poetic value must be judged on its own merit, a point that has been debated in length and breadth and in sharp and critical tones, though it is not relevant for us here in the context of the lecture. Goethe is considered, of course, one of the four pillars of world literature, along with Homer, Dante, and Shakespeare. A number of poets of other cultures have attained world renown as well. The first 5 Persian poets, Ferdowsi, Rumi, Sa'di, Nizami, and Hafez, have also won the rank among the great poets of the world. In recent years, Rumi in particular has become quite fashionable in the US as the subject of pop songs and popular talk shows hosts, though obviously not always for the right reasons. Before appearing in German translations, Hafez's poetry had been translated in other languages into English, French, and even Latin. In 1771, Earl Revitz, who died in 1793, an Austrian scholar, published some poems of Hafez in the form of Latin odes. In 1774, the British scholar Sir William Jones, who died in 1794, offered an overview of Arabic and Persian poetry and used the same style. Translations of Ferdowsi and Sa'di, translated the one by Olaarius in 1654. He did the translation of Gulistan as Persianisches Rosenthal. All of that preceded those of Hafez. Some poets have had the good fortune to have found very gifted translators. Our Omar Khayyam is one of them, whose 170 only to 180 quatrains won the hearts of many in the Western world, thanks to his philosophy of skepticism and the gifted translator Edward Fitzgerald. In Germany, the Orientalist Friedrich Rückert, who died in 1866, was one of those translators with great poetic sensibility who translated a number of Hafez's ghazals and portions of Ferdowsi's Shahnameh. Goethe is undoubtedly one of the great geniuses of world culture who lived for 83 fruitful years and eventful years. His multiple talents, his knowledge and range of interests span a wide horizon. I can here only touch on one small aspect in his vast poetic work. In Germany, Goethe is loved and considered as the greatest proponent of its culture. He was born in 1749 in Frankfurt am Main, at a time when Europe, or rather its various countries, began to see the world beyond its borders in the south and in the east in a different light. Reports of diplomatic missions and individual travelers opened up views into the world of Islam and its spheres of culture and influence that in turn led to a healthy curiosity and a more positive approach to inquiry. It is true, however, that in the beginning the study of Orient is its languages and culture, and I prefer to use the culture designation Orient in the European sense of the world instead of Middle East or Near East of today, was perceived more as a means to a better historical understanding of the Bible, in particular the Old Testament, than the study of Islam per se or the culture of the area. Only gradually did these studies gain independence. Risquet died in 1774, and Sylvester de Sacy, the French scholar, in Paris in 1758 to 1838. were proponents of the separation and are responsible for laying the foundation for this. Goethe's father, a jurist, intended the same career for his son and sent him to the University of Leipzig. The independence and freedom at the University of Leipzig and its influence, his intelligence and natural curiosity opened the eyes of the 16-year-old Goethe to the world of the arts, music, theater, and poetry. 2 years later, in Strasbourg, he became acquainted with the already famous historian and philosopher Gottfried Herder, who died in 1803. He was attracted to Herder's ideas of the aesthetics of language and poetry. Herder directed Goethe's attention to the riches and diversities of world literature. Their lives were professionally intertwined for a good many years until Herder's death in 1803, though the relationship was not free of tension. Goethe rose to early fame all over Europe with the 1774 publication of his novel Die Leiden des jungen Werthers. This masterpiece of Goethe's Sturm and Drang, or pre-romantic period, grew out of the unfulfilled love for a young woman whom he met in 1772 in the small town of Wetzlar. Over a century later, Thomas Mann picks up the story of Charlotte Boff in his novel Lotte in Weimar. Even Napoleon had read Werther and posed questions about him when he met Goethe many years later in 1808 during a meeting in Erfurt. Napoleon was interested in the poet, not the minister of state, and at the end of the conversation supposedly said, "Here is a man." That is Napoleon about Goethe. In 1775, Goethe's and Weimar's fate was sealed when Duke Karl August von Sachsen-Weimar-Eisenach invited Goethe to visit Weimar. He accepted the invitation to the tiny town of state assumed a high administrative and cultural position and stayed there for 53 years until the end of his life in 1832, and propelled Weimar into the center of attraction for German culture. During the long years of his creative and productive life, Goethe never shied away from acquiring new knowledge. His interests were wide and far-flung, be it in history, in languages and cultures, including the classical world of Greece and Rome, religions, religious studies, and the history of religions, including the study of the Old and New Testament, Zoroastrianism and Islam, or be it in the various branches of the sciences. For instance, in anatomy, he is said to have discovered a new human bone, and in physics, he offered the theory of colors that he considered his biggest achievement, equal to his literary work, despite the erroneous conclusions that he drew from his experiments. In light of his unique character, his quest for knowledge and beauty, his interest in the Orient does not really come as too big of a surprise. As for his sense of poetry and love of beauty, he found it in numerous encounters with women, some flaming up and being extinguished just as quickly, leaving only some ashes of memories, others tempting, taxing, and inspiring his soul, and as a result being reflected in his poetry and writings like Werther above or the Lily poems from the time of his acquaintance with his erstwhile fiancée Lily Schönemann. From the viewpoint of history of poetry and culture, the most important and far-reaching love in his life was that for the young and talented Marianne von Willemer. Making the acquaintance with Hafez and meeting Marianne almost at the same time overwhelmed Goethe at the age of 65. The emotional and intellectual impact left permanent traces in German literature and culminated in the famous collection of poems in the Westöstliche Divan, West-Eastern Divan. These two factors are for us the starting point to get to know Goethe and his Divan. Goethe's acquaintance with the East started early in his life. The translations and adaptations by Antoine Galland of 1001 Nights into French and later German translations belong to his favorite stories during his childhood and youth. He was familiar with the Old and New Testament. Later on, he studied the beliefs of other faiths and peoples. Zoroastrianism fascinated him. He called it the edle, the noble, Naturreligion, the noble or pure natural religion. That was his definition for Zoroastrianism. Early on, he planned to write a play about the Prophet Muhammad. The material he had drawn from the writing of the British scholar Sir William Jones and the French philosopher Voltaire. But from that early brush with the Orient, only a few fragments appear to have survived, among them the poem called Mahomet's Gesang, Muhammad's Song. More than 100 years later, Sir Muhammad Iqbal, who died in 1938, of Indo-Pakistani poet, he was inspired by that poem that he conceived of a very free translation into Persian, which was later published in his Payam-e Mashriq, Message of the East, in 1923. At the age of 23, Goethe began seriously studying the Quran, but disliked the translation. He wrote to Herder, "I wish someone with understanding for the original character world of the Orient would prepare a beautiful translation of this heavenly book. I wish I could pray like Moses in the Quran when he said, 'O my Lord, enlarge my breast for me and make my work easier, and loosen the knot of my tongue.'" In 1779, upon the request of Duke Karl August, he translated Voltaire's play Mahomet from the French, albeit with some changes. On January 30th, 1800, he produced the play on stage in Weimar. In 1813, after the Battle of the Nations, the Völkerschlacht near Leipzig, Russian soldiers in pursuit of Napoleon troops entered Weimar. Among them was a contingent of Muslims who used one of the Weimar schools for their ritual prayer performances. The novelty opened another angle of learning and understanding. Beside his youthful encounters with Oriental stories, he, that's Goethe, read some of the works of Arabic and Persian literature in their various degrees of perfection of the times, among them the Rose Garden, that is Golestan of Sa'di, selections of Ferdowsi's Shahnameh as well as experts of Rumi's Masnavi. The trail of his interest in visible and is visible in his diligent kept diary. Early in the summer of 1814, shortly before embarking on a trip to Frankfurt with the intention of regaining and rejuvenating his health, his publisher Goethe had sent Goethe the translation of Hafez's Divan by the Austrian diplomat and Orientalist Joseph von Hammer-Purgstall, who died in 1856. Hammer-Purgstall spent some time as Austria's diplomatic representative in Istanbul and Cairo and served as interpreter for 10 foreign languages at the Austrian imperial court. He translated a number of important pieces of literature from Arabic, Persian, and Turkish in German. These translations, together with numerous treatises he printed in the journal Fundgruben des Orients, Goethe perused these materials extensively in his preparations for his Divan. Goethe read the Divan of Hafez and was fascinated. In fact, he felt completely overwhelmed by this poet of Shiraz, who had lived 400 years before him and now was talking to his mind, heart, and soul. Goethe shared his impressions and thoughts with traveling companion and secretary Eckermann, who wrote them down. No other poet of the world, not even Homer or Shakespeare, with the possible exception of Calderon, had left such an indelible imprint on his soul. Hafez was the only one who shook this mountain of pride and glory and stirred him in those very years of fame and greatness to write a divan himself that, according to some scholars of German literature, equals Goethe's famous drama Faust. They unanimously acknowledge that the inspiration for the Westöstliche Divan can be traced back directly to the impact of Hafez, an impact that was not a blow but rather the touch of Hafez's finger, having created these most beautiful poems on the lyre of the West. To better understand Goethe's Divan, a better knowledge of the poetry of Hafez and a close acquaintance with Marianne von Willemer are essential. The impact of Hafez was such that by the time Goethe arrived in Wiesbaden, a resort town close to Frankfurt, on July 31st, 1814, after a week-long journey from Weimar, he had already composed at least 15 poems. In Wiesbaden, he was welcomed by an old acquaintance of his, Johann Jacob von Willemer, a banker and lover of art and active supporter of the arts and theater in Frankfurt, and his companion, 30-year-old Marianne Jung, who was well aware of the poet's fame and reputation and admired his poetry and was anxious to meet him. Marianne, the illegitimate daughter of a minor Austrian actress, had arrived in Frankfurt at the age of 14 as a member of a group of ballet dancers. She charmed her audiences with her grace. Von Willemer, a widower, impressed by her beauty, delicacy, and talents, was interested in furthering her artistic gifts, and with her mother permission, took her into his household and had her educated together with his own children. Goethe met Marianne for the first time on August 4, 1814. Several other visits occurred within a very short time span, and before Goethe left for Heidelberg. Then von Willemer, 24 years older than Marianne, married her on September 27, 1814. Some of Goethe's biographers jokingly or seriously note that the encounter between Goethe and Marianne had gotten Willemer very concerned that he might lose her. Nevertheless, Goethe received and accepted Willemer's invitation for a visit to the Gebermühle, the summer house of the family along the Main River on the outskirts of Frankfurt, exists even today. This historic building still exists. When he returned to Weimar in October 1814, he brought with him 50 poems he had written over the summer and which he now ordered together in the so-called German Divan. And from December 1814 onward, he embarked on intensive studies of Hafez and his world. He made extensive use of the collections of Weimar's library, founded by the Duchess Anna Amalia, checking out books, maps, manuscripts, and art books, consulted with Hammer Purgstall, Vienna, with Heinrich Friedrich von Dietz, the former Prussian representative in Istanbul, with professors in Leipzig and Jena. He tried to learn the Persian and Arabic script with the help and guidance of Paulus, his teacher Paulus, professor of theology and Oriental languages in Heidelberg. By the end of May 1815, he had written 100 poems that he ordered in one volume, the Wiesbadener Register. On his second trip to the Rhine and Frankfurt in the summer of 1815, he spent a little more than 4 weeks in the Gebermühle and in the Willemer's city residence and fell passionately in love with Marianne. Remembering the story of Joseph and Zuleika in the Old Testament, he had read in various sources, for example, in the poems of another Persian poet, Jami, he gave Marianne the name Zuleika. Was renunciation embedded in his choice from the beginning? Hatem represents Goethe. The young, lovely, sensitive, and perceptive woman was Goethe's inspiration to the book of Zuleika, by far the longest and most tender selection of the Westöstliche Divan. After a last meeting in autumn of 1815 in Heidelberg, the two, that is Marianne, Willemer, and Goethe, never met face to face again, but kept loosely in touch throughout the years by exchanging letters and small gifts. To the outside world, Zuleika remained an enigma. Was Zuleika an imaginary or a real person veiled behind the Oriental name? Literary scholars puzzled over and painstakingly analyzed the style in the exchange of love between Zuleika and Hatem. About 30 years after Goethe's death, that is in 1850s, when Marianne was 65 years of age, she lifted a corner of the veil from the secret during a conversation with Hermann Grimm and revealed that she indeed is Zulaykha. And the author of some of the poetic responses to Hatem being Goethe. Shortly before Goethe died in 1832, he had returned to Marianne all of her correspondence in a sealed package. The content was only made public in 1877. The story of the love affair between Goethe and Marianne von Willemer has special significance for German literature. Countless commentaries and analysis of the poems in the Book of Zulaykha, in the Westöstliche Divan, make the historic and artistic value abundantly clear. Now let us turn to Hafez, who died in 1392. We believe that we know him, and we should. But in reality, it's only his fame that we enjoy. Iranians call him the tongue of the invisible, Lisan al-Ghayb, and seek the answer to their questions of their heart's desire in his poems, divination. To talk about a figure or person who is both earthly and heavenly, the tongue of the invisible, as well as the mouthpiece of the human soul, Eastern and Western, a human being who reveals from within himself all dimensions of the senses and compassions, religion and faith, freedom and servitude, social relationships between prince and minister, and the common individual, the hidden corners of the heart and thought of the mystic, the ascetic, the sheikh and the mufti, the muhtasib, the police, the libertine and the dervish, be it woman or man, person who encompasses all these qualities and writes his songs, poems in the most engaging and exciting language that is unique and unmatched in the history of Persian poetry, perhaps in other languages as well. To talk about a poet of such caliber and quality, of such poetry is not possible in the course of a brief presentation. You will excuse me. No other Persian poet has ever attracted the hearts and minds of as many readers and scholars throughout the centuries. Hundreds of books and more than 7,000 articles alone have been written about him in Persian language. To understand why and how Goethe was so fascinated by Hafez and was moved to write his Westöstliche Divan requires a description of Hafez's character and time. Even though the ghazals of Hafez in their German translation must have lost their charm and delicacy, at least some of it, their music and the poet's tender style still evoked such magical response that, at least from the point of view of Hafez's philosophy, thought process and worldview, Weltanschauung, they were able to completely capture Goethe's imagination. During the course of his life, Hafez had witnessed turmoil, political and social strife, including patricides all over Iran. He had experienced disorder and unrest in the city of Shiraz under the ruling family of the Ali Inju, and had been the victory of Al Muzaffar, seen the victory of Al Muzaffar in the province of Fars, as well as that of the Jalayirids and Azerbaijan. He witnessed hypocrisy, the cheating and lying of the powerful, of the religious and the worldly classes. He was greatly disturbed by the social and political ills of the time and his surroundings, and castigated all of them in his ghazals. What relations, these are now some poems of Hafez. What relations do propriety, and piety have with rendi? Rendi is an expression very difficult to translation in any language. Includes in itself, rendi means being sharp, being a Sufi, being a worldly person, being everything you can imagine which is good, is in the word rendi. He says, what relations do propriety and piety have with rendi? A sermon's sound where, and the rebec's melody where. چه نسبت است برندی صلاح و تقوا را سماع وعظ کجا نغمه رباب کجا. My heart, tired of the monastery and the khirqa of hypocrisy, Magian's tavern and the pure wine where. دلم ز صومعه بگرفت و خرقه سالوس کجاست دیر مغان و شراب ناب کجا. Gone are the days of union, pleasant be their memories. Where did that loving gesture go, and that reproof where? بشد که یاد خوشش باد روزگار وصال خودان کرشمه کجا رفت و آن عتاب کجا. A dead lamp is where, and the sun's candle where. ز روی دوست دل دشمنان چه دریابد چراغ مرده کجا شمع آفتاب کجا. He denounced the man who took pride in having killed 700 people with his own hand in the name of God and religion, and then ordered taverns to be closed. A poet who believed in freedom of religion and responded the nobility of the human being, he furiously expressed his disgust and wrote, whether I am good or bad, you mind your own business. من اگر نیکم اگر بد تو برو خود را باش. In the end, each person reaps what he sowed. هر کسی آن درود عاقبت کار که کشت. ناامیدم مکن از سابقه لطف ازل که پس پرده تو چه دانی که خوب است و که زشت. It was this voice and this message so loudly and openly expressed in the medieval city of Shiraz 400 years before that reached the ears of Goethe, who, like a falcon that can spot the little ant on the bottom of dark well, was able to grasp the true meaning uttered in rhetorical garb by a poet of distant past. Again Hafez. Yesterday the school jurisconsult drunken gave verdict, wine is forbidden, but better than charity states. فقیه مدرسه دی مست بود و فتوا داد که می حرام ولی به زمال اوقاف است. Imam Khaja, who carried his prayer rug on his shoulder, was carried on shoulders from the tavern street the last night. ز کوی میکده دوشش به دوش می بردند امام خواجه که سجاده می کشید به دوش. Bring wine, for when you look carefully Hafez, the Sheikh, the Mufti, the Muhtasib, all dissimulate. همه تزویر میکنند. میده که شیخ و حافظ و مفتی و محتسب چون نیک بنگری همه تزویر میکنند. They are all lying. صوفی شهر بین که چون لقمه به شبهه میخورد پادمش دراز باد حیوان خوش علف. The Sufi moved from the monastery to the wine vat's side when he saw Muhtasib carry a jug of wine on his shoulder. Okay, I think that's enough of the poems. Hafez, in more than 150 ghazals, voices his outrage against hypocrisy, lying, and falsehood, mostly alluding to the dishonesty of the religious leaders and cruelty of the ruling elite. On the other hand was Goethe, perhaps fascinated by Hafez's philosophy, who, similar to other thinkers, was perplexed by the tension between free will and determination. That is, Hafez is saying, گناه اگرچه نبود اختیار ما حافظ تو بر طریق ادب باش و گو گناه من است. Although I did not choose to commit a sin, O Hafez, you be courteous and say it was my sin. Okay. Hundreds of lines turning around these thoughts are scattered throughout Hafez's Divan. They show how Hafez, in his exciting lyrical poems, voiced the ideas of Umar Khayyam and his philosophy of skepticism. Earlier, I hinted that at the taverns being closed by order of Amir Mubarez in Shiraz, a series of Hafez's ghazals openly express his anger and fury against the hypocritical order given at that time in Shiraz. Following some examples. I think I read only one of them in order to save time. In one of them he says, گر مسلمانی از این است که حافظ دارد وای اگر از پس امروز بود فردای. If being a Muslim is what Hafez has or knows, woe is him if there be a tomorrow after today. That's the day of resurrection. Explanations and analysis of Hafez's worldview are plentiful. Some call him a Sufi, ignoring the fact that Hafez himself denounced the Sufis as antichrist in their actions and anti-God in their mind. Was he a mystic? Perhaps, but not by the definition and meaning commonly used by superficial authors. Was he a religious person? Religious, most certainly, or else he would not have memorized the Quran and recited it in its 14 different recitations. That's what he himself says. He almost certainly never was the type of religious person who dishonored Islam. Contradictions in passing judgment on the inner feelings and convictions of a person, and particularly a complex personality like Hafez, who lived 600 years ago, are possible, particularly when you keep in mind that his own words and thoughts were developing and constantly subject to change and growing skepticism. In this context, judgment must necessarily be on shaky grounds. Now, Hafez was infatuated with love and beauty, with the ideas of freedom and humanism. His adoration of nature is jubilantly expressed in his poetry about springtime with the flowers and greenery. Yet, At the same time, he suffered from separation from loved ones, with a heart overflowing with pain, lamenting his loneliness in search of a companion. He shed tears, and yet he was afraid that they would tear apart the veils for all the world to see his sealed secrets hidden behind them. His advice, as in his own words, that's my translation, are: spending a moment with grief or suffering is not worth an entire life. Sell my cloak, khirqa, for wine, since it's not worth more than this. دمی با غم با می به سر بردن، جهان یک سر نمی ارزد، به می بفروش دلق ما که از این خوشتر نمی ارزد. His ghazals contain a myriad of subtle ideas whose magic effect no other poet has been able to create to the same extent, and yet Goethe, the great intellect, was capable of intuitively comprehending Hafez despite and beyond the distortions of the early translations. In other words, Goethe recognized his poetic twin behind the veil of inadequate words. After having established the two main factors that inspired Goethe to create his own divan, let us turn to the divan itself, which is a combination of two parts. The first part in verse form, the second in prose. The core of the divan, of course, is the poetic part, which reflects the thoughts and feelings of the Western poet at the time of his discovery of Hafez, as well as the growing and rejuvenating love for the graceful and gifted Marianne von Willemer. The second part of the divan contains the notes, Noten und Abhandlungen zum besseren Verständnis des westlichen Divan, that is, notes and treatises for the better understanding of the divan. The title spells out clearly the purpose of the notes. Goethe explains the reason for writing: I do not want anything to stand in the way of the first and good impression of my little book, that is, the divan. The notes are intended to acquaint those readers who are not familiar with the East or have no knowledge at all with the literature and the arts of the East. They offer scattered and sometimes disconnected pieces of information. Goethe acquired his knowledge of the East mostly practically from reading, unfortunately often unreliable translations, by the first generation of European Orientalists and their scholarly treatises written for the benefit of their fellow scholars and students, of reports also, and travelogues of Western diplomats or travelers, like, for example, the German Olearius, the Italian Marco Polo, and Piero della Valle, and the two Frenchmen Tavernier and Chardin. Goethe gained considerable knowledge from von Ditz, whose writings sometimes reflect a views through Turkish eyes. He heavily perused Hammer Purgestall Journal Fundgruben des Orient for his preparatory studies for the divan. With common knowledge of the East being rather limited at the time, it's no surprise that the notes are not free of errors. I remember well when I was a student in Germany and read the notes, I was quite amazed that a man of Goethe's intellectual capacity and his extraordinary power of creativity could have written those notes, while the poetic verses masterfully transmit feelings and thoughts inspired by his admiration of Hafez and his love for Marianne, and elevate our awe and respect for the poet to a higher level. The notes are somewhat disappointing and detract from Goethe's standing. Some German scholars of the time, who lacking the capacity and comprehension of Goethe's world view, found fault with his impressions, immense respect of Hafez, and yet his knowledge of the poetry of the East, of the poets, including Sa'di and Hafez, of its history and religious, is based on and drawn from the writings of these very same critics, since Goethe himself did not know either Arabic, Persian or Turkish. The main surface of his information were the German scholars. In his notes, he offers short biographies for 7 Persian poets. Alone, their shortness testifies to the unreliability of the sources. The number of lines, representing quantity, not quality, of course, shows the limit of available information to Goethe, and the content was often misleading. Here are a few examples in Beutler's edition. Goethe describes Hafez in only 67 lines. Maulana Rumi, the greatest mystic of the East, receives 40 lines. He devotes the same number, namely 40 lines, to Anvari, whose poems are entirely panegyric and not worth a penny. Ferdowsi, from our point of view today, of course. Ferdowsi, one of the greatest poets, not only of Iran but of the world, gets only 35 lines, less than Anvari. Nizami, whose 7 romances are the most elegant works of storytelling written in Persian, gets 19 lines. And Jami, the last of the great classical Persian poets, receives 17 lines. And finally, Sa'di, whom many, even in Europe, consider the greatest poet of the Persian tongue, receives a mere 13 lines. Here is what Goethe writes about Sa'di. He writes, as a young man, having been disappointed...
Sorry.
Agree, no. He writes about Sa'di, as a young man, having been disappointed by a love affair, he became a dervish, left Shiraz, visited Mecca 15 times, traveled to India and Central Asia, was taken captive during the Crusades, and after 30 years of absence returned to Shiraz and wrote his books and died at the age of 102. That's all. The information, I don't have time to go into it, is from the beginning to the end absolutely wrong, from the beginning to the end. Back to the beginning of the Divan at the time when Goethe's mind and tongue were spurting forth verses of the Divan with the force and swiftness of a fountain, starting in the summer of 1814. In 1819, the first edition appeared. He continued to write another 40 poems, which were added to the second and complete edition, which contained 250 poems in 12 books that he called with the Persian name Name, and was published in 1827. The assignment of poems to the individual books underwent repeated changes. The number of poems in the 12 books varies greatly. The Muqanni Name, book of the singer, 17 poems. Book of Hafez, 13 poems. Ishq Name, book of love, 18 poems. Book of Reflections, 27 poems. Book of Displeasure, 16 poems. Book of Maxims, 56 poems. Book of Timur, 2 poems. Book of Zulaykha, 48 poems. Book of the Cupbearer, Saginome, 22 poems. Book of Parables, 10 poems. Book of the Parsi, Parsi-name, 2 poems. Book of Paradise, 11 songs. I think my time is over and it's better I stop here. Thank you very much. Yes, yeah, I know. Varga is, my wife is asking me to ask if the permission.
You still have 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay.
I wrote here 7.
He has a poem that is Hāfez. In my translation it is, this is, O Hāfez, to think oneself equal to you. No. Yes, I'm sorry. Varga was a gentleman, a Baha'i of Iran, who together with his 9-year-old son, both were killed in 1896. Of course, far away from the world of Hāfez. But Hāfez, Varga has a poem which ends with, I recognize you. Every line ends with, Mi shanasamat, I recognize you. And there is a poem by Hāfez, by Goethe. The Goethe's Hāfez ends exactly with that same, I recognize you. Of course, the Persian poem is in Persian, Varga is in Persian, this is in German. But the similarity of ideas represented in the two poems, one by Varga, who died in 1896, and one by Goethe, who died some 70 years earlier, is striking. I don't think I should. Can you read it?
Sure.
I'm sorry, because I left great part of the presentation. I have to address this here. Here it is. This is the poem of Goethe. In 1000 Formen magst du dich, it is German though. In 1000 Formen magst du dich verstecken, doch allerliebste, gleich erkenne ich dich. Und ja, du magst mit Zauberschleiern dich bedecken, allgegenwärtige, gleich erkenne ich dich. An der Zypresse reinstem jungem Streben, all schön gewaltige, gleich erkenne ich dich. In des Kanals reinem Wellensleben, all schmeichelhafteste, wohl erkenne ich dich. Wenn steigen sich der Wasserfall entfaltet, allspielende, wie froh erkenne ich dich, wenn Wolke sich gestaltend, umgestaltet, allmannigfaltige dort erkenne ich dich. I don't go to the end of it, but then Varga, who died, was rather killed some 70 or so years later, as I mentioned before, has a poem almost exactly like Hāfez, with the rhyme of with Goethe, so with the rhyming word of میشناسمت. If you allow me, I will read that poem of Varga in Persian, which goes faster. ای مشرق جمال خدا میشناسمت، جان و سرم تو را به فدا میشناسمت. گر 100,000 پرده بپوشی به روی خویش، ای طلعت خدا به خدا میشناسمت. تو رب مغربینی و خورشید مشرقین، ای آفتاب رجع و بدا میشناسمت. شاهی اگر نمایی و گر بندگی کنی بر عرش هر مقام، جدا میشناسمت. ای موجد معانی و ای مبدع بیان، از لحن و قول و صوت و صدا میشناسمت. ای طلعت معانی و ای هیکل ظهور، در هر لباس و قمص و ردا میشناسمت. گر خود صمد وگر صنمی میپرستمت، و در لباس شاه و گدا میشناسمت. ورقا بگو به نغمه بر این سدره ظهور، ای مشرق جمال خدا میشناسمت. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Moayyad. I think for many years in this university and in all university, maybe with the exception of Hebrew University, Persian literature hasn't been read or definitely not studied, but it is a fresh breeze to have your talking about two pillars, as you said, of one Eastern literature and one of Western literature. And I would like to invite people to ask questions. That's why I cut you short a little bit. Just
yes, absolutely. I'm sorry if it was too long.
Well, I think I have a few. I mean, you spoke about the extent that Goethe was influenced by Hafez.
Yes.
Yes, and in your view, what's the contribution of that influence on the development of, shall we say, Oriental studies in general, or Iranian studies in particular in Germany? Or in other words, where you would place Goethe contribution to that development of that studies in Germany?
I think I very briefly, though, mentioned that the quality, the personality of Hafez in Shiraz of 700 years ago. The rulers of Shiraz, the 2-3 families who ruled in his lifetime, he lived from 12. He was a poet of the 13th century. At that time, Shiraz was divided practically, ruling the city of Shiraz, between a number of families. The boy, as a young man, killed his own father in order to get the rulership. Then there was the enemy. They were constantly fighting each other. And Hafez was seeing this killing of families, one another one, and one replacing the other family. And he was completely opposed to this sort of treatment of human being, to this lack of humanity. And the Shiraz, which was a city of love, before Hafez, Sa'di had lived in that same city, and he had more peace of time than the century in which Hafez, the others were ruling in Shiraz, where Hafez was living. In any case, the political conditions of the city of Shiraz really inspired Hafez to write so much against hypocrisy, against doing something that is hypocrisy. The mullahs forbidding wine, and themselves were making wine at home. All such things were completely opposed to the personality and philosophy of Hafez. And Hafez, one characteristic of Hafez, as I mentioned in my talk, He has one of the titles he has is Lisan al-Ghayb. The people open in Iran to this day, after 700 years or so, open the divan when they have a problem. They want to know, should they marry this fellow or not? Should he go on this trip or not? Should I buy this house or not? Any important decision to have to make. There are two books they open and seek for answer. One of them is obviously Quran, but Quran is because of its religious characteristic and quality. More so they do with Hafez. And that's, they call him Lisan al-Ghayb, the tongue of the invisible. He answers to questions. And there are many anecdotes about that, even by great scholars who have written about the cases. Hekmat, the Minister of Culture in Iran, the famous man, he, in his book, he translated Brown into Persian. When he comes to Hafez, it's Brown talking about Hafez, Hekmat, the translator, fills pages about the kind of falgiri from Hafez, how it is really true that Hafez is Lisan al-Ghayb, and you open his divan, he answers your questions. But there are also funny stories about that, but I can't go into that.
Yes, Professor Cooper-Smith.
Well, thank you very much for this very interesting talk. I actually have two questions. One is Goethe, well, was an outstanding intellectual figure in Germany. How much influence did he have on, let's say, anything which was translated from Persian or maybe also other Middle Eastern languages into German later on? Because this was, well, a masterpiece which he wrote,
yes,
and it was read by intellectuals. I can see that it had an impact. So I wonder how you see this divan of Goethe's having an impact on later publications in Germany up to maybe even the 21st century.
Yes.
So this is one question. The other one is concerns some criticism against Goethe and against Divan, which you mentioned. Now, how much would you say? No, I want to. This is technical criticism. Was there any criticism against Goethe for him, or discussing things and translating things, or interpreting things? That's really the word in Germany, which were, well, not very popular at the time. I think it was very exceptional. Was there anybody saying, well, he deals with Muhammad, who was a false prophet, and so on, like we have in the Middle Ages? How do you did you come across any theological criticism against
Goethe,
or ideological criticism against Goethe?
First, about the question concerning the translations of Hafez into German. Yes, there are some translations. I know not all of it. A complete translation has been published recently. An Iranian, no, that's in English.
No, that was English.
That's in English, I'm sorry. Even a fellow has translated the entire Hafez into English. Whether it's good or bad, that's a different question. But yes, Hafez is some people have tried to translate Hafez into German as well. I know Helmut Ritter, who was a brilliant scholar, of course, he worked on Attar, as you know. He also translated certain ghazals of Hafez. When I was a student, he translated them and published them. Others have, Shader has tried to translate portions of Hafez into English. And who else? I can't hardly remember. There are some have tried to translate Hafez. They know, if not for Hafez's own sake, for the affiliation of Hafez and Goethe together, in order to better understand Goethe, they feel they have also to understand Hafez a little more, better. So the translations of Hafez do exist. If I am not able to mention a complete one now at this point, I apologize. Perhaps you remember any, but at least portion of Hafez have been translated by different scholars, yes.
But with your permission, I didn't only mean Hāfez. It's much broader. It's a much wider literature, not only in Persian. It's also Arabic, Turkish, and so on. It could have been a tremendous boost also for German Orientalism, which it wasn't. Not in this proportion, I think, if you look at the masterpiece that Goethe created.
But also in France, there was a boost of Orientalism, of novelists who went to Turkey or.
Yeah, but here again, the story of German Orientalism is maybe, we don't know for 100%, is maybe a little bit different from the story of Orientalism in France and in Britain.
Yes, I only know of fractions of Hafez's, not the entire divan, to my knowledge, doesn't exist in a German, at least not in a good German translation, and many German scholars are interested in Oriental studies, of course, and there in Hafez, perhaps, if I'm not mistaken, not because of Hafez himself, but rather because of his connection with Goethe and because of the Westliche Divan. But fragments, a few ghazals here and there, many people have tried and published some, not the entire.
And as to the criticism,
The religious criticism of Goethe, because of him dealing with Islamic world and
Islam,
yes,
Eastern,
Eastern.
there was a translator in German more than 100 years ago, famous for translating huge amounts of works from Arabic, Persian, and Turkish, from all these languages. Rückert.
Mahler,
Rückert, yes. Yeah, it didn't occur to me at first, yes. Rückert, yes. He translated Hafez. Now, how good is his translation? I haven't checked it. I haven't looked at it. It's beyond my interest to devote my
Mahler
time
himself
to.
said that he wasn't
to
sure that
Rückert.
it was the right translation.
Rückert-lieders of Wolf, toch? Yeah, Wolf.
Any more questions?
Zuleika as Wolf.
Yes, please.
You mentioned earlier that Goethe was attracted to Hafez because because his poems were also about reflections about free will and etc. If I'm correct, can you elaborate more on this topic? How did he help maybe Goethe in this subject?
Oh, because as mentioned, the conditions of Shiraz were such that were attractive.
Wars and,
Yeah, they were. Well, Germany in the time of Goethe, I should perhaps ask my wife to answer the question, because how Germany was at the time when Goethe was there, and it was not a united country, perhaps. That can you explain and answer
I
that?
didn't quite get the question, but as far as this turmoil is concerned, Heshmat mentioned the Völkerschlacht von Leipzig. On the way alone, I mean, just one little incident. On the way back from Russia, the French overran Weimar and really looted. So, there were similar conditions. Like in Shiraz, all this restlessness and the turmoil. The same thing happened in Germany in those years.
But
And Goethe was very perturbed by it.
what I was asking is whether Goethe got any consolidation from Hafez about his questions about the old regime, the ancien regime, and the modern nationalism, modern German nationalism, something about that.
Well, that he was tremendously impressed one way or another, perhaps even the beauty of the language, the expressions Hafez uses. Because, to take two poets, Saadi, as I mentioned, lived 100 years before Hafez, and the ghazals of Saadi are extremely, extremely beautiful to everyone. However, they do not go deep. They are on the level of beauty and really song. The Persian songs, of traditional Persian songs, they use Persian classical poetry as a text for their music. there is hardly, I don't remember any single one of them ever having taken a poem of Hafez. All of them take the poems of Sa'di, all moving on the surface on beauty and love. That is the language of Sa'di before Hafez. Whereas Hafez is deeper. Hafez has a philosophy and lived at a time when the city of Shiraz at the time of Sa'di had a more comfortable life. And as they say, we don't know how much of it's true, Sa'di traveled to all those countries, was taken as a captive in North Africa, went to India. Many of those stories are just stories. They are not facts. We know that. He wanted to create a scenery for bringing his anecdote in his Gulistan and write poems as well. Whereas none of these things are true in the case of Hafez. Hafez is purely and really a person who lived in Hafez in Shiraz, did not live even Shiraz in his lifetime. He was once invited to go to India, and he made a trip from Shiraz to the port city Bandar Hormuz or there. And the moment he saw the boat, he said, no, dami ba gham be sar burdan jahan yek sar nemi arzad. To live in pain and sorrow and suffering for one moment, life is not worth that. He returned back. He didn't go there.
The world is not worth it.
The world is
yes,
not worth it. Jahan yek sar nemi arzad. Or they say some biographers have mentioned that he even made a trip to Isfahan once. But that is not true. That's not confirmed by the most recent researchers on Hafez.
I would ask, I think, the last question, because there is a class, they have to go back to their businesses. We know that during the Nazi regime, they tried to, through this monthly Iran Bastan mainly, and through a lot of archaeological studies and findings, they tried to stress the bond between Iran and Germany on the Aryan issue. Yes. My question is, given the popularity of Hafez in Iran, whether the Germans tried in this period of Nazi Germany, there was any attempt to use this Hafez and to make studies in order to to strengthen the bond between the two people?
I don't think that was, because neither Hitler nor Iranian authorities in power at that time knew what Hafez means, what Hafez is. They are busy with capturing, Hitler had reached practically the borders of Iran, and you can imagine. And in Iran he had many friends among the population. And
agents.
Pardon me?
And agents.
Agents, yes. And all of them were thrown out the moment the Russians captured Iran, on the one from the north, from the Caucasus, and the British from the south. And all the Germans who were working in Iran, in industry, roads, everything, all of them had to leave. Not only them, but even practically the creator of the modern Iran, now that tens of 60, 70 years have passed, Reza Shah Pahlavi, who put an end to the Qajars, created universities and roads and gave freedom to women, all of that. He had to leave Iran, because the Russians and the British didn't want him. He had not listened to their advice, because they believed that the Germans have reached the border. If he's in power, and then it will be trouble with us. They needed practically to capture Iran in order to transfer armaments by boat, by Iranian railroad from the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf, coming from America to Persian Gulf, put on the trains and sent to Russia. So they didn't need Reza Shah. And so his son, for a number of years, was just as a puppet in the hand of the foreign countries, until he gained more confidence in his power and became the Shah the way he was, unfortunately.
But Hafez, in your view, they didn't use?
No.
No, okay.
No.
That's
Absolutely
okay.
not.
Thanks again to Dr. Heshmat Moayyad
Thank you very much
for his
inviting
very
me.
interesting lecture, and I just want to remind you that tomorrow Dr. Moayyad has agreed to present another lecture, this time in the Baha'i lecture series regarding Persian Baha'i poets and poetry, a general overview. Of course, everyone is welcome. Thank you very much for coming.